In this clip, we're going to be exploring the modern historian debate surrounding the Emperor Nero. These modern historian questions are going to be focusing on the typical interpretations of the Julio-Claudian emperors, and we're going to need to use ancient sources to either support or challenge those interpretations. So typical views of Tiberius would be he was a tyrant, Gaius as mad and driven by divinity, Claudius is a weak and controlled emperor, weak and influenced by his wives and freemen, and Nero as a lunatic. What we're going to be briefly investigating here is whether Nero deserves this reputation as this lunatic, psychotic ruler who descends into autocracy, tyranny, and debauchery. Now, the important thing with Nero is that we have a major problem with our information, and all of our sources are either senatorial or sympathize with the Senate's humiliation at Nero's hands, whether that is Suetonius or Tacitus or Dio. Importantly, we can't forget the positives of Nero's reign. So, to start off with, we have the 5 golden years of Nero's reign, and that's detailed in Suetonius from verse 11 right the way up to verse 17. And of course, we can't really negate the whole achievement of a smooth succession after the death of Claudius. There is certainly the possibility of some type of civil war or unrest emerging from two rival heirs, Britannicus, Claudius's natural son, and Nero, Claudius's adopted son. And certainly Agrippina's influence is key to that. And you can see that evidenced by the coinage that's produced at the time and also Suetonius. There's also positives in regard to Nero's assistance and attitude towards the Great Fire of Rome. And that actually comes from Tacitus, and some real positives in there, despite Tacitus being a hostile source. And of course, we can't forget that Nero is incredibly popular with the plebs and the people of Rome for his generosity and for his largesse. Now, we're going to focus on one key example, which is the Great Fire of Rome. And Suetonius is actually way more negative than Tacitus in his coverage, because he believes that Nero actually started the Great Fire of Rome. The reason why is that because he coveted the land for his new palace that he wanted to build, and he pretended to be disgusted by the buildings and the streets. And importantly, from Suetonius, this is where we get the idea of Nero fiddling while Rome burnt, singing from the gardens of Maecenas about the fall of Troy. The reason why he does this is because he wants the land of Rome to build this huge palatial complex, the Golden House. Importantly, in Suetonius, though, we do get a reference to a fire relief fund, but even that is made negative because of supposedly it bleeds provincials white and beggared private citizens. Now, that's important to contrast with another source that's overwhelmingly negative about Nero, and that's Tacitus. Tacitus in 1539 actually talks about some of the positives in Nero's response to the fire in terms of opening the fields of Mars and his own private gardens, emergency accommodation, subsidizing the price of grain and food being brought from Ostia. And then he talks about the improvements given or implemented in the aftermath of the fire, such as the rebuilding of Rome, the building regulations, the money spent on rebuilding the actual city, the public water supply being increased. So there's some real improvements in the way that Nero beautified the new city. So Tacitus is a little bit of a contrast to Suetonius, which is interesting. And of course, remember that Tacitus is pretty much a near contemporary of Nero, and he certainly would have known people that were involved in the fire and in the response to the fire, whereas Suetonius is writing much later on and won't have had access to those sources. Of course, we can use Suetonius for the scandal of Nero's character. In verse 26, we get about his lust, his greed, his cruelty. Verse 27 talks about his vices. We get discussions of his cruelty and his sexual gratification in verse 28 and verse 29. And of course, there are the other negatives mentioned by Suetonius and Tacitus. Certainly his love of Greek culture and his love of Greece, and really sort of maybe his disregard for Roman values. But do remember, of course, that his love of performing and love of chariot racing is really a positive with the actual people of Rome as well. We've got the murders of Claudius Britannicus and Agrippina. Certainly, in terms of the murder of Britannicus and the use of the poisoner Locusta, Claudius and the supposed poisoned mushrooms. And remember, of course, that Seneca lampooned Claudius in that pamphlet as well. Agrippina's murder is naturally portrayed really negatively by all of our sources, and the lengths that Nero goes in order to murder his own mother. You've got the discussion of the influence of Tigellinus, the Taurian prefect, whose cruelty really has a negative impact and further pushes Nero down the road of tyranny. You've got the clear mistreatment of his wives, such as Octavia, and supposedly the negative influence of Poppaea, but then she herself succumbs to Nero's tyranny and is murdered by Nero himself. And then, of course, you've got Suetonius's coverage of the Great Fire of Rome and the fact that then Nero, in both of our sources, uses this as an opportunity to create this huge palatial golden house, which is pretty much a symbol of his tyranny. The important thing with Nero, though, is to always counter the likely negativity with an awareness of some of the positive perceptions of him, mainly from the actual people of Rome itself.